Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and on today's episode, we're doing a follow-up to an episode from last year with Dr. Yara Shimshoni on a parent-focused approach to anxiety treatment called SPACE. So many of you expressed interest in this. We got feedback, we got comments. I've never heard about this. I want to learn more. And you were excited to understand how you can use new strategies to positively impact your child's anxiety symptoms. Anxiety continues to be a leading mental health issue for children and teens, and even more so now with the pandemic situation that we've been living through over the last almost year. So we need new and innovative approaches to treatment. And the great thing about a parent-focused approach is that parents can be in control of moving the process forward. So today I have the pleasure of having Dr. Eli Lebowitz on the show to talk with us specifically about his new book that he's written for parents called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. Now, this is a book focused on parents that's going to allow you to understand your child's anxiety and work on reducing it in some new ways, even if you don't have access to trained professionals. So let me tell you a bit about him. Professor Lebowitz studies and treats childhood and adolescent anxiety at the Yale School of Medicine Child Study Center, where he directs the program for anxiety disorders. His research focuses on the development, neurobiology, and treatment of anxiety and related disorders, with a special emphasis on family dynamics and the role of parents in these disorders. Dr. Lebowitz is the lead investigator on multiple funded research projects and is the author of research papers, books, and chapters on childhood and adolescent anxiety. His work has been recognized by private and public organizations, including the Brain and Behavior Foundation, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. He's also the father of 3 great boys, so he's a parent just like us. Dr. Lebowitz, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I've been wanting to ask you this. You and I have had interaction outside of doing the podcast. I had the great privilege of taking your practitioner training over the summer. So there's a question I've been wanting to ask you, which is how you developed an interest or a focus in studying and treating childhood anxiety disorders in the first place. Was this always an interest of yours? Were you doing something else and sort of stumbled on this? Tell us the story of that.
So I've actually been interested in child anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder for many years. But my interest in parent-based approaches actually stems in part from an experience that I had now many years ago when I was working in a large children's hospital. And I was actually working at the same time in 2 programs there. One of them was an anxiety and OCD clinic where we did cognitive behavioral therapy with kids. And the other program where I worked was a parent guidance unit for parents of youth with severe externalizing behavior problems. And there, as is often the case, we worked with parents because youth with really serious behavior problems are not always ideal candidates for direct therapy themselves. Now, one of my jobs in the anxiety program was actually to screen incoming new families to try to gauge how good of a fit they would be for our treatment program. And one really big question that I would ask right away is, does your child want help? Is your child interested in therapy? Because we know that cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure and response prevention for OCD require a high level of motivation and collaboration and engagement on the part of the child. And so if the answer was no, I could already let them know that there wasn't a great likelihood of this succeeding. But I really became increasingly frustrated because on the same day, I might be having that conversation with the parents of a child with anxiety or OCD and telling them, look, if your child's not interested in treatment, we may not be able to help you. But on that very same day, I might meet with the parents of a child with behavior problems and tell them, we don't need your child to be here. We can work with you. We're going to give you the tools to overcome this problem. And that just made me really frustrated and led me to think a lot about what can we be doing with and for parents parents of children who have anxiety or who have OCD, where their child is maybe not going to benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy? And how do we not have anything to offer those parents? And that really led me to think a lot about what we could do to help those parents, which ultimately contributed to the development of this treatment space.
I love that story, and it connects so much to my own experience of working with kids in the realm of more significant autism spectrum disorders, severe emotional and behavioral disorders, and being trained in and taking a very parent-based approach to that. And then noticing, like, why aren't we doing this everywhere? And, so we've sort of just been doing that at our clinic. And then when I happened to come across an article about space a while ago now, I was like, yes, that inherently makes perfect sense to me, because why wouldn't we work through the parents? So I love that that's how you came to that as well. And so needed in the realm of anxiety and OCD, because what you're saying is so true, that the typical approach of cognitive behavior therapy, it really does require that the child's going to be engaged. And we've seen so many families at our clinic where they're like, yeah, my child was exited from treatment, or they said they couldn't work with us, or they said, they were discontinuing because, my child won't engage. He won't do the work. He doesn't want to come to sessions. And so I think that's such a powerful difference with what you're offering here.
Yes, that's exactly it. And even when a child is willing to engage in CBT, we know that the treatment is not going to be effective for everybody. Clinical trials show that approximately half of children who get cognitive behavioral therapy are really going to have very good response. They're going to be a lot better after treatment. And that's fantastic. And if you are a glass half full kind of person, then that's really good news when we think about how prevalent these problems are. And they really are so prevalent in the population. But it also leaves another half of the glass empty. And so, certainly for children who are not going to do CBT at all, but even for children who are, having another tool in our toolbox, another approach in our arsenal of how we can help these families is just tremendously important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm of the mindset as a professional that we need to be aiming a lot higher than 50% in our outcomes with people. And if we're not, let's explore why we're not and what else we can do, which is exactly what you and your team are doing in the realm of anxiety and OCD. I want to get into in a minute some of the really practical things that you talk about in the book. But before that, I want to sort of pave the way for that by having you talk a bit about what you think parents need to understand about childhood anxiety and OCD, and maybe even touch on why the anxiety and the OCD are connected. Why write a book about anxiety and OCD together? What do you think parents need to understand about that most parents don't? Or, maybe another way of looking at that is, what are we missing in how we typically approach this?
Yeah, it's a really fantastic question. And I think there are some big points here that can be made and that are really important to understand. And one of them is that the real heart of any anxiety disorder, the core of the problem is actually not entirely about being more anxious than somebody else. So often when we think about anxiety disorders, we think, well, okay, that's a child or an adult for that matter, who simply has more anxiety than someone else. And that is true, but it's not the whole story. Most of the impairment, of the real disabling, sometimes really crippling impact of an anxiety disorder actually stems from the fear of experiencing anxiety, from not wanting to feel anxious. And that is what drives so much of the impairment in these very common problems. So that may sound a little confusing, but think about it like this. You may have, say, two children who have a frightening experience. Maybe they're walking home from school and a really big dog barks really loudly next to them, and they're both scared in that moment. They may both be equally startled and afraid in that moment. But after a minute or two, they're going to start calming down. And if one of those child walks away from that thinking, well, that was scary, but okay, it's over. And the other child walks away from it thinking, that was horrible. I never want to feel like that again. That was so unpleasant and aversive for me that I just never want to have that experience. That's the child who's going to develop the anxiety disorder, because the next day they're going to cross the street when they go near that house. And the next day, they're not going to want to walk down that street at all. And soon they're not going to want to leave the house at all because there could be a dog somewhere. Or maybe they won't want to see a movie that has a dog because it reminds them of that horrible experience. And so a lot of the impairment actually stems from not wanting to feel anxious. And one thing that parents can really do that is so tremendously helpful for their children is convey to them the message and the idea that it's actually okay to feel anxious some of the time. It is uncomfortable, but it is okay. It's something that you can handle and it will pass, as opposed to it's a horrible experience that we should avoid at all costs, because then you're going to really have the anxiety problem. And that's one thing. I think that's one really important message that it's just so useful for parents to really get. You said something really interesting, which is, what have we been missing? And actually, I think that's a really great question to ask, because space as a treatment actually builds on a really important aspect of child anxiety that we have been missing for decades in how we conceptualize these problems and how we think about treatment for these problems. You know, if you were to compare a treatment manual, for example, like for cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, if you were to compare a treatment manual for children and a treatment manual for CBT for adults with anxiety, what you would see is that they are the same. They're essentially the same thing. Of course, we use somewhat different language when we talk to a 7-year-old, and we use other words when we talk to a 47-year-old because they're older and more mature. But the principles of the treatment are the same because we're thinking about the anxiety in the same way. And here there really is something missing, because child anxiety is actually meaningfully different from adult anxiety. There's a lot that's the same, but there's something special about child anxiety that is different. And that is children's natural tendency to respond to fear by looking to their parents to protect them. Children know instinctively that they're not able to protect themselves. We're born not able to defend ourselves and protect ourselves. And so in children, and this is different from adults, in children we respond to fear by relying on our parents. What that means is that if a child has an anxiety disorder, they're going to be looking to their parent all the time for reassurance, for protection, for soothing and regulation. And what it means is that when a child has an anxiety disorder, it's not only the child that has the anxiety disorder, it's the family system, it's the parents as well. Not because the parents are necessarily more anxious, but because they become involved in their children's anxiety, because they're stepping in to try to provide that protection and that regulation and that soothing. And this is a meaningful difference that hasn't really been captured in our established typical treatments for anxiety. And it's something that space really does in a big way.
Absolutely. And I think, to me, that really, that's such a great description of something that we have been missing across the board in our approach with that, and probably explains a lot of why parents, even if their child has been through rounds of cognitive behavioral therapy, still end up feeling sort of frustrated or sort of at loose ends. We've had parents come in and say, but what can I do? You know, what do I do when my child is, you know, coming and repeatedly asking me these questions, other than tell them, you know, use your breathing strategies or try to distract yourself or, you know, whatever. And so I think that parents, a lot of them inherently realize, like, there's some role that I am playing in this. I want to know how to do this differently.
Right, that's exactly it. And you asked another important question, which I'll just touch on briefly, and that was about why OCD? Why is OCD in there? I mean, it's in the title and it's part of what the treatment is for. And even though we don't formally classify OCD as an anxiety disorder anymore, although we did up
Right.
until
Yep.
2013,
Yep.
even the DSM, right, the Merck Manual of Mental Health, officially classified
Right.
OCD as an anxiety disorder. Even though we don't do that formally anymore,
Mhm.
actually, in many ways,
Yeah.
OCD is an
Right.
anxiety disorder. And it goes to exactly what I was saying. You know, lots of people are going to have obsessive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, but the child who develops OCD is going to be that child who doesn't want to have that experience, who thinks this thought is so horrible to me, it's so scary to me, or embarrassing, or strange, or weird, and frightening that I never want to have that thought. And that child is then going to develop the compulsive rituals of OCD to try to banish those thoughts, to try to fix them and correct them. And they're the ones who are going to be trapped in that loop of obsession and compulsion, because it's always fear that is the driver of OCD. You know, nobody has obsessions about winning the lottery because people are not scared about winning the
Right.
lottery. And actually, this is maybe the most important thing for a parent of OCD to know about OCD is that a child's OCD thoughts, they don't tell us what that child secretly wants.
That's
They
right.
don't tell us, you know, some hidden truth about the child. What they tell us is what the child fears, what they're afraid of. Anxiety and fear are the fuel that drive the engine of OCD. And so the treatment for OCD is very similar to the treatment of other anxiety disorders. That's true for cognitive behavioral therapy, it's true for medications, and it's also true in space.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that's important to touch on the connection there. And really, I mean, how I think about this and explain this to parents and to kids, it's all about managing uncertainty, right? We have different thresholds for that. There's uncertainty in the world. When a parent comes in and they say, I just want my child not to be anxious, it's like, well, that would be really weird. And actually a problem, right? If your kid was never anxious or if you were never anxious. The goal is that we increase our threshold, our tolerance level for being able to manage uncertainty in our lives, uncertain things that happen. And to me, this is really about helping kids to better calibrate that. Some kids are just more prone to that tolerance for uncertainty is really low. And so everything feels scary and they're driven to avoid, whether that's an anxiety disorder where it's truly like more avoidance of it or ruminating about it, or it's obsessive compulsive disorder where the way that they're trying to deal with managing that uncertainty and that fear is their rituals and their compulsions. It's all aimed at the same thing. As human beings, we don't like to feel uncertain, do we?
No, we don't. We definitely don't. We like
Yeah.
predictability, we like control, we like certainty. These are things that
Yeah.
are not always achievable, they're not always there for us. And so learning to live with a lower level of certainty is actually the best way to not go through your life suffering because of anxiety. You know, the real goal of any treatment for an anxiety disorder is actually not entirely about just, I want to be less anxious. It's a lot about getting better at being anxious.
That's right.
If you can be anxious and handle that, you're going to have less anxiety in your life. And when you are anxious, it's not going to be as big a problem. When you feel like you can't be anxious and you shouldn't be anxious, that's when you're going to get more anxiety and more impairment to go along with it.
That is the quote of the day right there. For those of you who are listening, I want you to just really take that in, that the goal is to really get better at handling it. And that's our goal for our kids. It's not to create a world where they don't experience the discomfort of the anxiety. It's to help cultivate within them the sense of, I can feel anxious and I can handle it. And that's it right there. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So it occurs to me that we should, for people who maybe did not hear the previous episode, I want to have you say what SPACE stands for. And then I want to get into really some of the things that you feel are most important to touch on with what parents will find in the book. What are some of the key things that you really wanted to impart to parents in writing this book? Because obviously you felt there was a need for this. There was something that drove you to say, I need to create this for parents and not just focus on training professionals. So I want you to then talk about, what are the things that parents can take from it?
Yes. So first of all, SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And what SPACE stands for is Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And what SPACE stands for is Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And what SPACE stands for is Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. The book is something that I have been really wanting to do for a long time. I'm so excited that it is coming out and will be available for parents. And that's partly because I know that not every parent is going to be able to access a skilled, trained therapist. Sometimes there's just not anybody in your area who's able to provide that help. Sometimes it is too costly. Sometimes you do not have the resources to be able to devote the time, the money, the energy, etc., to actually going to therapy. There are so many people who are struggling and are just not going to be able to get the kind of care that you might get from a specialized, skilled therapist. And so I've really been wanting to do this for a long time, and I'm really happy that it is going to be available now. The book itself is a real guide to working your way through this treatment process in the way that you might do if you were working with a therapist. And so it is not just about the principles. It's not a theoretical book to just understand anxiety in principle, which is a great thing to do and certainly a valuable and useful thing, but it's not enough. Right? If I'm the parent of a child with anxiety, I am faced with endless specific challenges and questions and dilemmas every moment of every day. And so just having a principle or an idea is often just not going to be enough. What I need is a systematic plan, something that will really take me through this one step at a time. And that is the goal with this book, that parents will be able, if they take the time to read it and to work through the steps as they're laid out in the book, to really be able to treat their child's anxiety. That is an ambitious goal, but that is really the goal.
And I was going to say, I've had a chance to look at the book ahead of time, and I think you really accomplished that. And I just want to say this for all of you parent listeners. Sometimes, there's books about treatment protocols or things that you might pick up to read to try to help your child, and it's really dense and it's like hard to figure out, how do I apply this? This book is really geared towards the practicalities of here's what you need to understand and here's how to do this. I really firmly believe that any parent could walk away from this, even if you didn't read the whole thing cover to cover and you took pieces of it. It really does hit the nail on the head in terms of giving practical strategies, ways to think about this, things that you can start doing differently with your child. And so I think it's important to say that, because sometimes you think, oh, another book that I'm supposed to read, but this really is a practical guide. So I really think you accomplished your goal with that.
Well, thank you. First of all, really thank you, because that's awesome feedback, and it is certainly my goal and what I was going for. For that reason, the book is written in very readable, relatable, I hope, language. I wrote it, yes, as a therapist and a doctor, but also as a parent, and as a parent of a child who is often very anxious. And I'm in the same boat as every other parent who deals with their children and with child anxiety. And so that's really where I'm writing from. That's why it is written that way, why it is not longer than it has to be, and not more expensive than it has to be, because the goal is really to try to make this as accessible as we possibly can. In terms of the actual principles, what can parents really take from this? What are the real principles here? We can boil down everything that parents are going to learn to do through working through this book into two main things. And that then breaks down into a lot of very specific steps, but there are really two big picture things, two main goals. The first is to learn how to respond to your child when they're anxious in a supportive manner, to be supportive. And we have a very clear definition of exactly what is meant by a supportive response, because 10 people could have 10 different ideas of what is supportive.
Right.
But I have a really clear and specific definition. You're being supportive when you show your anxious child two things. You show them first of all, and this is so important, that you get it, that you believe them, that you understand it, that you accept it and acknowledge it. You cannot be supportive if you can't accept that your child is genuinely struggling, even if you don't really understand why, or even if you feel differently yourself, or you wish that they felt differently. If you can't accept that that's their experience, then how can you really be supportive of them? And that's one part of the supportive message. The other part, and this is also so important, is a message of confidence. The idea that I, as your parent, I believe that you actually can tolerate and handle distress, that you can be uncomfortable now and still be okay. And so often our responses to children when they're anxious actually don't convey that message.
Right.
Very often we convey, I need to rescue you from this because you can't be anxious and it's not okay, or it's going to damage you in some way. And you think about it from a child's perspective, it's great if there is somebody to always rescue me, but it's not great to feel like I always need to be rescued. That's such a vulnerable feeling. So, if you are vulnerable, it's great to have someone there to rescue you, but it is better to know that you're actually okay. Just like it's great to have somebody always feed you, but actually it's pretty good to be able to feed yourself,
Yeah.
right? And not need to always have somebody else step in and do it for you. When you put those two things together, the acceptance and the confidence, that's when you're being supportive. That can be a really simple thing. It can be as simple as saying something like, I get it. This is really scary for you, and I believe that you can handle it. I'm not asking the child to say that they believe it.
Right.
I'm just telling you what I believe. And that's one of those two big picture things that parents can really learn. And there's a lot of very specific guidance on how do you come up with those phrases and how do you respond, etc. The second thing is really about those accommodations, all of those changes that parents make to their own behavior because their child is anxious. And it's the most natural thing in the world. It's not, this is not like you're doing something bad and evil because you accommodate. It just means that you're a sensitive, loving parent who wants to help your child. And it's the most natural response in the world. So for example, your child is really worried. You want to reassure them. You want to tell them, it's okay, that thing's not going to happen, or you're healthy, or you're not going to mess up, or something, or maybe your child is socially anxious. You want to make it easier for them. You want to speak in place of them because they get awkward and uncomfortable. Maybe they have separation anxiety. You want to be close to them so they feel safe. Maybe you're sleeping next to them at night so they're not scared when they're alone. These are well-intentioned accommodations, but a huge amount of research now shows that when you do these accommodations, even if your child is feeling better in that moment, actually over time, they're not getting less anxious. They're getting more and more anxious over time. And so you're just pouring tons of time and energy and resource, sometimes even money, into trying to accommodate, but your child is not getting less anxious. So the second thing parents will learn to do in a very clear and systematic way is, first of all, figure out, what accommodations am I doing? Right? Maybe I'm not even aware. And so there's real guidance on how do I identify those accommodations? And then how do I pick one thing to focus on? We're not just going to say, okay, never accommodate anymore at all. That would be overwhelming for your child, and you probably couldn't do it anyway. So how do I pick one specific thing? How do I make really clear plans for reducing that accommodation? And crucially, how do I cope with my child's response to me reducing the accommodation? Maybe my child gets upset. Maybe they get angry at me. Maybe they say something really painful for me to hear, like, don't you care about me anymore? These are hard things. And so there's a lot of very clear tools for coping with those responses in a supportive and loving way while continuing to reduce that accommodation to help your child get better. And the last thing, I know this is a long answer to your question, but the last thing I really want to emphasize, because I think it's so important for parents to know, is a promise that I make to parents. And that promise is, at no point in this treatment am I going to ask you to make your child do anything.
Yeah.
You're not going to have to make them practice a skill.
Mhm.
You're not going to have to make them not do anything, because it turns out oftentimes you can't.
Uh-huh.
Right? I can give you great advice. Like, you got to make your child practice this wonderful skill. Then you go home, your child says nothing doing. I'm not interested. I don't want to do it. Now you're stuck. And that's my fault as the therapist, because if I told you you have how do I make him do anything?
Right.
And so throughout this entire process, this is my promise. You will not be asked to make your child do something or to make your child stop doing something. It's all going to be about that, your own behavior, about the one person that you actually do have some control over,
Mhm.
and that's yourself.
Which is such a freeing and important thing, because so many parents, especially if they've been through a lot of other treatments, it's like, they want to get involved in power struggles, like they want a hole in their head, right? It's like, okay, you can tell me all these things, but how do I do this? And I think that that's really the empowering part of that. And the flip side of that I want to have you touch on is sometimes parents take that then and say, oh, so you're saying that it's my fault that my kid, is anxious or has an anxiety disorder, which is not the case, but I want to have you touch on that.
And I'm glad that you raised that, because nothing could be further from the truth. I not only am I not suggesting that parents are to blame for their child's anxiety, it is factually not true. It's just not right. And our whole field, mental health, psychology, psychiatry, social work, we have done so much harm in the world by blaming parents for children's mental health problems. Parents have been blamed for everything: schizophrenia, autism, eating disorders, anxiety problems, everything. And time and again, empirical research shows that it's simply not true. Not only is it hurtful and unhelpful, it's also just wrong. In the vast majority of cases, really, the vast majority of cases, a child has an anxiety disorder because they were born with a predisposition, a vulnerability to anxiety, not because you did too much of this or not enough of the other thing. It is, of course, possible to behave so atrociously as a parent that you could damage your child's mental health. Yes, that is possible. If you severely neglect your child, if you abuse them physically and emotionally, you're going to do harm. But that is not the story for almost all the cases of child anxiety. And so I think it's so easy to make that leap from, well, you're saying treat the parents, and so you're probably blaming the parents. And I cannot say emphatically enough that it's simply not true. And just like, if your child has a physical illness, you're going to have to help them to overcome that, right? You're going to have to do things differently because your child is sick. That doesn't mean you made them sick. It just means you care about them. You love them. You want to help them. And so the message here is parents can be a solution to their child's anxiety problem, but they're not the cause of the child's anxiety problem in the first place.
Yeah. Such an important thing for parents to understand. And I think what's been interesting, both in just treating families and working with parents for a long time, but also specific to doing space treatment with families. While the emphasis is on parents changing the way that they're managing things to support the child in better managing their anxious feelings, there is also this synergistic effect where parents who tend to have more anxiety about things and who recognize that for themselves have some new awareness and some improvement that they discover in themselves as well through going through the process. And I'm curious if that's something you've seen in your treatment.
It's 100% something we have seen in treatment. And in fact, we've even studied that empirically through research. And so, we've done randomized controlled trials of space treatment. And the main goal there is to assess, is this treatment making the child less anxious? But we assess parent anxiety as well. And what we see is that parents are reporting lower anxiety levels following space. Even though the treatment is all about the child, we're not trying to directly treat the parent's anxiety, but they're reporting less anxiety. And we're also seeing other beneficial impacts. And maybe this is an important one to highlight. We're seeing improved parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
And I stress that because sometimes parents are concerned, I'm going to start removing these accommodations and maybe my child is going to get upset with me. Is this going to damage the relationship? Are they going to feel abandoned or neglected or rejected or something like that? And what we see is the opposite. Both parents and children report better parent-child relationship following space treatment, even if there are some difficult moments along the way. Maybe in that first week or two, your child is a little bit more upset with you. And if we ask them right then, how are you feeling about what your mom and dad are doing right now? They may say, it sucks, I don't like it. But when we do it in a supportive way, A, they see that we're acting out of love and care. B, they're getting better and their anxiety is going down. And what we see at the end of treatment is actually improvement. And we shouldn't forget that the burden of accommodation actually takes a toll on the relationship.
Absolutely.
It's exasperating, it's frustrating, there can be resentment and anger, and that takes a real toll on the parent-child relationship. So it's actually wonderful to see that relationship improving.
Mm-hmm. To me, it's just one of the many benefits of doing parent-focused treatment is not just the direct benefits to the child, but the benefits that everybody in the family system gets. And even like we could touch on siblings here as well, while the treatment may be directed towards the child who's struggling with managing their anxiety, there's all kinds of dynamics that emerge in families where parents are accommodating a child's anxiety and then siblings get dragged into it. And so I would go so far as to say that when parents are working through the steps that you outline in the book, this has a very positive benefit for the entire family system.
Yes, that is 100% true. Siblings are very much impacted by their siblings' anxiety, sometimes really directly. So for, maybe I have a child with an anxiety disorder. The whole family can't do certain things, and the sibling is paying a price. They can't have play dates, or we can't go to your baseball game because we have to be with the other child who has anxiety. The burden is shared and everybody is impacted. And so one reason that siblings benefit is the sibling is getting less anxious and the impact on me is improving. Another reason is often siblings also have anxiety. And, by treating the parents rather than the child, it means that they're learning tools that they can apply for their other children as well. And finally, I think it's a really positive thing. Even if you're not the child with the anxiety, being in a family and seeing my sibling has a problem, my parents helped them. My parents knew how to step in and help them to get better. That's a wonderful thing for me to observe as a sibling as well, because these are my parents too. When I have a problem, they're going to help me. And so I think you're absolutely right. Working with parents gives us an opportunity to really have beneficial impact on the whole family, the child with anxiety, the parents, and the sibling as well.
Fantastic. So many more things we could talk about. I know we're running low on time. Obviously, everybody listening to this is going to be ordering the book right away. We'll tell them how in a moment, but I want to give people something to latch onto in the meantime. It's going to take a few days, to get the book in their hands. If there was one thing that you would encourage our listeners to start with, something that, they get done listening to this and they're like, man, this makes sense. I want to start working with this. What would be something that everybody could begin with?
The very first thing is start practicing being supportive. Come up with your own supportive phrase. Just have those two ingredients, right? Acceptance and confidence. I see it's hard for you, and I believe that you can cope. Start using those words. Maybe just saying that one time is not going to erase your child's anxiety disorder completely, but you're starting to show them a vision of themselves as someone who is both understood and accepted, but also someone who can cope. And you're starting to introduce that language into your interactions with the child. So number one, just start practicing being supportive and learn more about space. You can visit, even before you have the book, there's so much more information. You can visit the website, which is spacetreatment.net. I'm sure you'll have a link, but it's spacetreatment.net. And there are so many resources there for parents and for therapists to learn more about this treatment. There are videos that you can watch, some longer and some shorter. There are many articles, both research articles, case studies, so you can read about the treatment of another family, and many media articles like in the Atlantic or NPR or CNN, and just, those are really written for the general public reader. There are podcasts like this one,
Right.
and others. And there's even forums so that you can interact with other parents who may be coping with the same issues. And that's such a supportive and strengthening experience, just to be able to say, yeah, I'm working on this too, and this is how it's going for me, and just sharing that. And so there's a forum where you can have those conversations. You can do it anonymously if you prefer. You don't need to give your name or your child's name. So I think that's a good resource for in the meantime and throughout.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up the professional piece, because for those of you who are in our professional community who are listening to this, I mentioned earlier in the show, I've been through the professional training with Eli and his staff. Can't recommend it enough. Go on there and look. Even right now, you're doing the virtual trainings because it can't be in person. There's a wealth of resources there if you're a professional in a variety of fields who's interested in bringing this information and these strategies into your work with kids and with families. Great resources there as well. And I believe also there is a directory. I mean, obviously the book is a resource for parents to sort of do the do-it-yourself mode, but for families who are interested in seeing if there's someone in their area, there's a directory on the website too,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, and thanks for mentioning it. Absolutely. There's a directory of therapists who are trained in space with their contact information. It's searchable by state within the United States. We now have at least one person in almost every state in the United States. They're not full 50, but we're getting there. We're close. And if you're in another country, increasingly more and more countries represented as well. We don't have the whole globe covered yet, but we're working on that too. So you can find somebody to work with. And so many people today are doing teletreatment that even someone further away may be able to work with you as well.
Right. And so if you are getting the book and you say, I'm going to start working with this myself, and you hit some patches where you're like, I'm not sure how to work from this, it's a great combo. I think it's a great, and if you are already a parent who's working with a practitioner doing space, having the book is a great resource for you to have to refer to at home. So those dovetail well. Let's tell people the book is out right now, and let's tell people where they can go to get it.
So yeah, the book is out. It's called Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD. I'm the author, Eli Lebowitz, and you can get it where you get your books.
Right.
You get it on Amazon. I think probably lots of people are getting it on Amazon. You can get it in bookstores, and even directly from Oxford Press, who is the publisher.
Yeah, and we'll have the links as always in the show notes. Highly encourage all of you to go and check that out. We will be referencing it and recommending it widely here at our clinic, and so recommend it for all of you. Eli, thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule, especially with the new book launching, to be here with us to talk to our community about this. Such impactful information, so important that we're spreading the word about this. So really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was really a pleasure being here.
And as always, thanks to all of you for being here with us and listening. We'll catch you back here next week for our next episode of the Better Behavior Show.